The third project I was looking at was a literacy project, which is in, so I had, just to explain, I spent part of the time in Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, where the head office is, and part of it I spent in Madang, which is a bit of a more rural, coastal area, a flight away from Port Moresby. So the first two projects were in Port Moresby, and the other two projects were in the Madang area. And this one here is a project to teach future teachers, well, to train teachers to provide functional literacy training. So functional literacy is really a very low level of literacy to do the basics of going to a market and being able to do just small selling jobs and those kind of things, to also like do the counting right and really basic literacy. And the idea was not to only train people but train teachers so that they can keep on training, which was a very long established project. All of the four projects, they had been set for about a time frame of 4 years, and when I was there they were all about halfway through. The literacy project was the only exception because it was a follow-up project, so it was already the second round that this project had been operating, which later on I contributed to the extremely high level of participatory communication in this project, just because it had been so well ingrained in the community, and they had been the community asked to continue with this project. And the fourth project was more like a research project, sweet potato project, and so the goal was to trial and evaluate and disseminate new appropriate sweet potato plants, varieties in the rural farming community in Madang. As a bit of background, there's just good, sweet potato is like the farmers grow it there a lot, but there are so many different varieties, and just some of the varieties are very productive and effective, and just to trial and see if they may change to different plants and varieties, just to improve with the outcome and the crop. And part of so one part of this project was pretty much just distributing those plants and having the contact with the people, but they had regular, well, a bit like focus group interviews on a regular basis, just to discuss with all the farmers how they like it, how they do with it, how it's growing, what works well, what doesn't work well. And then they have also something they call participatory technology development meetings, which is not just a small group, it's from the whole area. They put them all together and exchange not only best practice knowledge on sweet potato growing, but on a general farmer-to-farmer best practice approach, because a lot of people never left their village, and so they didn't have the chance to actually exchange those type of best practice with just a neighboring village, because it has been just from the not really easily accessible to go to another village. I hope it all makes more or less sense. So once I came back then, after having been there about 5 weeks, that's when the majority of the analysis happened. So some of the analysis started already when I was there, just by really refocusing my thoughts and going through the data and trying to make it already a bit meaningful and clustering around. But obviously the majority is then later on. That's the tricky part, where it really pays out to have a very interesting topic that excites you in the middle of the night at long hours. You probably like to do different things than thinking about your research. And the problem with the issue, a challenge with a qualitative approach, especially with that one, was that I had a lot of data, and it was all in text form, and it was very. It is very unsorted, so it's just the amount of data was more the problem. And so I tried to put this into 5 steps, but it's not really. It is actually not 5 steps, because the interesting aspect of an ethnographic approach is that it's really all in cycles. So you do your initial coding, your initial focusing, your initial looking into it, and maybe having the research once the research questions in the back of your mind, and also the findings from your literature review, but then trying to be really open to everything new. And you're going through this in several cycles. Because in the beginning it was just all those pages and pages full of text. The first step was seriously just highlighting it with a pen marker, and then so gradually limiting the amount of data I had. And so after having had the very first CAL, I used the software N4v, which probably now has a different number because it probably upgraded since then, which was very helpful to use the software to just have it a bit more sorted and have it all on one screen instead of having piles of paper and all different folders on the computer where I had to link them up. It was quite a helpful tool also to mark. You can do exactly the same as just in any Word document with highlighting and marking, but it gave you more options to put memos in or some other notes to yourself, or put them into clusters already, which was very helpful. And the issue is really to try to not focus on the literature review so much, so the findings of it, but try to be open to really look at new categories or anything that sticks out a bit, or maybe doesn't make sense when you compare the participant observation data with the interview data. So it's really a bit of playing around, which sounds great, but I mean, in reality it's just text, so it's limited amount where you can actually play around. But it's really a cyclical and recursive process of just doing the fine tune and focusing on something. And there was a lot of data which I thought initially, that it's very interesting and very relevant, but the scope just got too big, and so I had to narrow it and had to disregard some data which probably make another project in itself. But it was just too much to focus on. Those 4 sub-questions were very good to keep me focused on what I actually have to look for, and it was quite good. And also creation of models, which I just started with hand scribbling some, how does this and this belong to each other, was very helpful. Again, with the software tool, there's a function how you can quite easily do it. Also, you can obviously save all the different drafts if you decide later on maybe the draft version 1 was better than the one I'm currently working on, just to not forget, lose all this information. Then, and then once I was at that stage, that's when I really looked into comparing it with the literature review, and found out quite a few differences and different, in the end I actually, I'll show you the findings in a second, but the literature review, I thought originally when I set out that, well, I have my 12 factors that I found in the literature review, and I probably, you always have your assumptions, but I thought, I'm probably finding about, that some of those ones are more relevant than the other ones. Maybe there is one or 2 additional factors somewhere, or maybe some of them, they are not mentioned at all. But later on it was actually quite different, because the factors, I grouped them completely different, I named them differently. There were some overlaps, but the majority of the factors just didn't quite match with what I found in the literature review. It was very specific to that area. And so so after that, then the comparison with the literature review, then there's the complex depth analysis, and that's when you're almost about to make your conclusions and you're almost there. And from the research design, there are obviously 2 other things to consider: the ethical considerations and limitations of the projects. I touched already a bit on some of those topics before. So the ethical consideration is really the big difference to doing an Auckland-based project was really that I went to Papua New Guinea in a foreign culture from my point of view. Also, when I handed in at the ethics committee my proposal, I had to really defend myself why I wanted to do something like this, and if it's really appropriate, and from a moral and ethical perspective, if it's appropriate. So I really had to respect the local custom and culture as much as possible. And I did it by reading a lot of background information about the customs, culture and protocols in Papua New Guinea and talked to the relevant people. And I sought the advice of the Papua New Guinea employees in the site area. And I learned a few basic words in Pidgin English just to establish a bit of a better relation with them. And also there, got to taught a few advice on non-verbal language, which is almost as important as the actual verbal one. And one very important part from an ethical point of view is to report back your research findings to the community, because it may just contribute to more having a feeling of being exploited if there is this white girl coming and doing her thing and they never hear anything back. And I was not able to report back to the community in Papua New Guinea directly, but I presented to the World Vision people here in Auckland, and also the country coordinator looking after Papua New Guinea. So that was my way to fill that back, and I also sent the research, the final piece, then to all the World Vision employees in Papua New Guinea to make sure that as much as possible is reported back. And from the limitations, well, what I said already before, it obviously limits it, considering I'm a European young female white researcher. It definitely has an impact on my thinking and what I focus on. And also the fact that I did it with a non-governmental organization, the research has advantages and disadvantages. So my big advantage was to actually be able to access communities and have this introduction. But on the other hand, the disadvantage is that if you link too closely to an NGO, to an organization working on the ground, they may more perceive you as a worker and may not say all the bad things or critical things, just to be afraid that maybe some of the funding will stop or other may have other implications. So having those factors in mind is probably the best to limit them as much as possible. I mean, it's not possible to get rid of them, but at least you can limit the risk of the influence, impact. So from a point of findings, I don't want to go into too much detail here as well, but so my findings were basically I found 10 interrelating factors in total, and I clustered them around 3 themes. That's what the data, after looking at the findings and then interpreting all this, how I, after many recursive cycles of coding and recoding came out. So one of the themes is level of trust, and then there's, I flipped through, there's three of those themes, so 3 similar of those models which I created. And I had a number of factors, so those green bubbles are the factors and the square is more the theme where the factors are clustered around. And so there are some of those ones which are the same as in the literature review. It's just the way how they came out, they're just a bit different, and they were not clustered at all like this in the literature review. So yeah, a number of those ones. And then also the attitudes and behavior of staff towards the participatory development communication seem to be one of the leading themes. And as you can also see, so there are factors impacting the actual theme, but also they're impacting each other, and some of them impact on some of the themes. So that's where the whole complex situation came in. There was the serious challenge in the end, trying to put it on paper and make it understandable for someone else to read and passing the research requirements. And the third theme was meeting the perceived needs of the beneficiaries. So not just meeting the need that was identified by World Vision, but more the need they actually, the stakeholders perceived as a need. And then here again, a number of factors impacting this one. So this was really just very brief touching on the actual findings, and you're more than welcome to either ask questions or go and download the 160-page thesis.